The talk I put together for you today started as an idea to better organize my writing sometime last summer. For about the last 2 years, I've been writing on a fairly regular basis about topics that are, well, to be honest, it was blogging, so it's not quite writing. I've been writing about a number of topics that are of interest to me: DRM, piracy, workflow, publishing innovation. And I started to feel that there was a common theme underlying all of them. So around that time, the Internet Archive put out a call for papers for a conference that they called Books and Browsers. So I went to the, I submitted a proposal to the Internet Archive, and it was called the Unified Field Theory of Publishing, a little bit grandiose, and around the dinner table we started just referring to it as unified. Around the same time, David Wilk invited a number of us to attend a series of discussions, one in a series of discussions he calls Publish the Future. And along with me, he invited Bob Stein, who leads the Institute for the Future of the Book. After the discussion, we had Bob and I had a chance to compare notes. We both submitted proposals to the Internet Archive. I was proud of my idea, and particularly particularly proud of the title, but I was still a little bit nervous showing it to him. But he'd shown me his, so he took a look at my proposal, gave it a really close look, turned to me and said, "Is that really the title of your talk?" And I responded in a somewhat squeaky voice, "Yeah." And he said, "This isn't getting better." And he told me at that point that he had created notes for a talk with exactly the same title 2 years earlier. Fortunately, and not surprisingly, Bob's talk was about something different, broadly the evolving and changing roles of publishing in a networked world. Mine is somewhat different. I'm here today to talk about the damage done by what I call the container model of publishing. But it's fortunate that I can borrow from Bob's title, as I'll begin to explain in a minute. Starting now. Thank you. Thanks. Before I do that, though, my idea in a nutshell is this. Book, magazine, and newspaper publishing is unduly governed by the containers that we've used for centuries to transmit information. These containers define content in two dimensions, necessarily ignoring that which cannot or does not fit. Worse, the process of filling the container strips out context. The critical admixture of tagged content, research, footnoted links, sources, audio and video background, even good old title level metadata, that's a luxury in the physical world, but a critical asset in digital ones. In our evolving networked world, it's a world not just of books and browsers, but of content in browsers. We're no longer selling content, or at least not content alone. We compete on context. I propose today that the current workflow hierarchy, container first, limiting content and context, is already outdated. To compete digitally, we must start with context, preserve its connection to content. We need to start thinking about containers as an option, not the starting point. Further, we must start to open up access, making it possible for readers to discover, consume our content, both within and across digital realms. Without a shift in mindset, we're vulnerable to a range of current and future disruptive entrants. Containers limit how we think about our audiences, but in stripping context, they also limit how our audiences find our content. Here, scale's not our friend. In fact, it may be the enemy. As Clay Christensen first outlined in 1997, disruptive technologies don't look or feel like what we traditionally think they should. Often enough, they're cheaper, simpler, smaller, and more convenient than their traditional analogs. Already, smaller, more nimble digital startups have reversed the paradigm. They start with context, which is vital to digital discoverability, and then they use it to strengthen content. Many startups forego containers entirely, or they create them only as a rendering of personal consumer preference. Think Craigslist, think Monster, think Cookster, a born digital food site that started with and continues to evolve its taxonomy. Context first. As barriers to entry have fallen, I started to think more about how traditional book, magazine, and newspaper publishers can survive in a digital era. There are both new and non-traditional established entrants across most publishing segments. Their successes have pushed traditional publishers to look at ways to change business models and organize around customers. It's time to see our publishing brethren, newspapers and magazines, as part of a disrupted continuum that affects us all. Digital makes convergence not only possible, it makes convergence inevitable. Marketers have become publishers, publishers are now have marketing arms, new entrants are a bit of both. And customers rather, have become alternately competitors, partners, and suppliers. Now, a few minutes ago, I mentioned that Bob Stein, in an extended introduction, Bob Stein and I share a title of this talk. That overlaps a coincidence that reminded me of a passage from a book I love, Salman Rushdie's 1990 book, Haroun and the Sea of Stories. If you're not familiar with the book, Haroun, as a young boy, sets off to find tales for his father, who's lost his ability to tell stories. And along the way, he comes across If, the Water Genie, who at first does not treat Haroun particularly kindly. But at a low point, the Water Genie relents and starts to tell Haroun about the ocean of the streams of story. And even though he was full of a sense of hopelessness and failure, the magic of the ocean began to have an effect on Haroun. He looked into the water and saw that it was made up of 1,001 different currents, each one a different color, weaving in and out of one another like a liquid tapestry of breathtaking complexity. I'll stop there for a moment. We'll return to the story in a bit. But first, I'd like to use it as a jumping off point, a call for us to imagine. Imagine a world in which content authoring and editing tools are cheap, even free. Imagine a world in which storage is plentiful, even virtual. Imagine a world in which content can be disseminated in a range of formats at the figurative or literal push of a button. That world exists today, with literally dozens of credible, accessible tools and resources. These authoring, repository, and distribution tools make it possible for anyone to create, store, and distribute digital as well as physical content. The thing is, while that world's already here, it's far from evenly distributed. A couple of years ago, in a discussion with Laura Dawson and Mike Shatskin, I sketched out a version of this somewhat basic diagram of the kinds of content best served by XML. The typical winners are in the upper right, genres like cooking that have many components, or what Laura would call chunks, and a higher probability of being recombined or reused. Our problem is, we're not the only ones looking at these markets. While publishers think of agile workflows as an opportunity to drive down the cost of making content for containers, a newer breed of born digital competitors has started with context. These new entrants are developing taxonomies and tools that give them the ability to invade the same niches that we thought we were making more efficient. The challenge is not just being digital, it's being demonstrably relevant to audiences who now turn first to digital to find content. New entrants, who I think are our real competition, start with the customer. They develop contextual frameworks that help them differentiate both readers and themselves. The new guys like the new tools because they're cheap, scalable, and open source. In fact, they're already exploiting tools that many traditional publishers lament are just too hard to learn. And I asked myself, how did we get here? And I think there's a reason. In their physical forms, newspapers, magazines, and books establish the boundaries of both content and context. Historically focused on containers, we become stuck using them as the primary source for digital content. Only after we fill the physical container do we turn our attention to rebuilding the digital roots of content. The context, including tags, links, research, and unpublished material that can get lost on the cutting room floor. Most of that context never makes it back. We've taken to using things like search engine optimization, title-level metadata, and an occasionally effective use of syndication as proxies for something contextually rich. Competing as we are against the born digital, that's not nearly enough. Further, we treat readers as if their needs can be defined by containers. But in a digital world, search takes place before physical sampling much more often than the reverse. Readers may at times look for a specific product, but more often they search for an answer, a solution, a spark that turns into an interest and perhaps a purchase. Publishers are in the business of linking content to markets, but we're hamstrung at search because we've made context the last thing we think about. When content scarcity was really the norm, we could live with a minimum of context. In a limited market, our editors became skilled at making decisions about what would be published. Now, in an era of abundance, editors have inherited a new and fundamentally different role: figuring out how what is published will be discovered. To serve that new role, we must reverse our publishing paradigm. We need to start with context and develop and maintain rich, linked digital content. We also need to use the tools we have, as well as the ones we have yet to develop, to make containers the output of digital workflows, not the source of content in those digital workflows. This is a fundamental change in our approach, and it's the only way that I see to compete in a digital-first, content-abundant universe. And I don't think that this change in mindset or workflow will come easily, something that Gus, who follows me, will also talk about. Over time, we've adopted a series of mental models that constrain our ability to change. The long history of using physical containers to distribute content, for example, has led us to conflate format with brand. Perhaps there was a time when the physical nature of content products, actually their look and feel, dominated, but in a digital era, I think that its time has passed. In a similar way, we often speak of digital content as a derived or secondary use. The ongoing debate about e-book rights underscores this. Who owns e-books rights is a different topic, but the Open Road and Wiley dust-ups are telling for the question that was not asked. Who owns the context that drives discoverability, use, and value in a digital realm? Investing in context is now a requirement. Unfortunately, a product focus and an obsession with scale lead us to worrying more about finding ways to reduce costs. We think about making the physical object incrementally better, optimizing the production, delivery of content in a single package. Along the way, we miss opportunities to create agile, discoverable, and accessible content. I call this situation container myopia, paying homage to Ted Levitt's 1960 article, Marketing Myopia. In the article, Levitt called upon marketers to shift from a product-centered to a customer-centered paradigm. He famously showed how railroad companies had failed to see that they were in the transportation business, much as publishers have struggled to see that they're increasingly in the content solutions business. In a digital realm, true content solutions are built with open APIs, something that containers are pretty bad at. APIs, application programming interfaces, provide users with a roadmap that lets them customize their content consumption. The physical forms of books, magazines, and newspapers have analog forms of APIs. Terry Jones would say they're user interfaces. We've all figured out how to access the information contained in these physical objects, but the physical form itself does not always make a good API, something that Craigslist, Huffington Post, Cookster, and others have capitalized on. Open up your API, I contend, or someone else will. You can't have a unified theory without pirates. Many current audiences and all future ones live in an open and accessible environment. They expect to be able to look under the hood, mix and match content, and create seamlessly something of their own. Failure to meet those needs will result in obscurity at best. To illustrate that point, I'd like to tell you a story, and to do that, I need to bring you to perhaps the most hierarchical, closed, inaccessible environment I know of: an American public high school. This particular building is the main entrance to Columbia High School in Maplewood, New Jersey, where our youngest son, Charles, is a junior. The school opened in 1927, and it's not changed a lot in the 80 years since then. And in case there's any ambiguity, the more recent picture's on the lower left. Last summer, Charlie learned happily that he'd earned a 5 on the AP Art History exam. This made him eligible to serve as a teaching assistant for this year's art history class. All he needed to do was align his free period with a scheduled slot for art history. I don't know how many of you have tried to parse a high school scheduling API. It seems to rely on green screen devices, stacks of forms, and a queuing process that guarantees you won't have your new schedule in hand until at least 2 weeks into the school year. On a Friday in July, Charlie came home to find his junior year schedule. His free period did not align. Now, Charlie's seen his older brother and sister fight the powers that be at Columbia High School, sometimes unsuccessfully, and he decided to pursue a different course. Lacking access to the master schedule, he went to a free resource. It's called Facebook. Posted his schedule there and asked anyone who attended Columbia High School to do the same. By Sunday morning, 36 hours later, he had gathered enough data to compile his own master schedule. With this information in hand, he rearranged his classes, filled out a homemade change form, sent it to the high school on Monday morning. "Please give me this schedule," it said. Problem solved. Stories like this one, as well as everything that Kirk Biglione has ever said about DRM, have led me to see piracy as the consequence of a bad API. 16-year-olds expect access, or they invent it. The future of content involves giving readers access to the rules, tools, and opportunities of contextually rich content so that they can engage with it on their own terms. And whether they say it like this or not, readers want good APIs. Content is no longer just a product. It's part of a value chain that solves readers' problems. Readers expect publishers to point them to the outcomes or answers that they want when and where they want them. We're interested in content solutions that don't waste our time, which is a precious commodity for all of us. Perhaps most daunting of all, readers have come to expect that content solutions will improve over time. They don't care that much about, or if at all, about how that happens. Companies that are good at aggregating content solutions will reduce the time and hassle involved in finding and buying something. These firms have a leg up on their competitors. These ideas are drawn from the prescient lean consumption model that Daniel Jones and James Womack debuted about a half a decade ago. They're embodied in services like Amazon. They're characterized in offerings like Kobo and Kindle. They offer more than products, they provide solutions. So if containers are now an option, and content must be made accessible, what is the role of context? First, let's establish a context of our own. Freed from physical constraints, we no longer have to write the length. We can link, we can expand, we can annotate. As low or no cost authoring, repository, and distribution tools and resources become freely available, it's axiomatic that ours has become and will remain an era of content abundance. Put simply, content abundance is the precursor to the development and maintenance of context. When there was only the Gutenberg Bible, we didn't need Dewey. When booksellers were smaller and largely independent, we didn't have that much need for BISAC codes. And before online sales made every book in print evident and accessible, Onyx was kind of an unattended luxury. Digital abundance is pushing us to create much more than title-level metadata. To manage abundance, we can and do use blunt instruments like verticals and somewhat more elegant tools like search engines. But when it comes to discovery, access, and utility, nothing substitutes for authorial and editorial judgment as evidence in the structural and contextual tags applied to our content. Context can't be just a preference or an afterthought anymore. Early and deep tagging is a search reality. In structural terms, our content fits search conventions or it will not be referenced. And in contextual terms, our content needs to be deeply and consistently tagged or it will face an increasingly tough time being found. We can't afford to build context into content after the fact. Doing so irrevocably truncates the deep relationships that authors and editors create and often maintain until the day, hour, or minute the containers render them impotent. Building back those lost links is redundant, expensive, and ultimately incomplete. This isn't a problem of standards. At places like Indiana University, where Jen Riley and Devin Baker have been working, they vividly illustrated the abundance of contextual frameworks available to us. The problem we face, the one that we avoid at our peril, is implementing these standards. And ultimately, that's a function of workflow. If strategy's ahead, I liken workflow to a circulatory system. We all know how hard it can be to change organizational direction, but in practice, it's a matter of coordination. If you decide you want to go somewhere else, your head tells your arms and legs to swing one way or another, and off you go. If you want to change workflow, though, you're looking at the publishing equivalent of a heart transplant. And starting with context requires publishers to make a fundamental change in their content workflows. And this is at a time when we're struggling to create something as simple as a clean Onyx feed. So planning for and preserving connections to content is a challenge of significant proportion. And we don't have that much time to get it right. Although the precise changes in workflow are going to vary by publisher, certain principles apply. I think moving from a mindset of product to service or solutions means at least 4 things. The first is that our content must become open and accessible. Adherence to standards will not be an option. Second is that because we compete on context, we're going to need to focus more clearly on using it to promote discovery. Because we're competing with businesses that already use low and no-cost tools, trying to beat them on the cost of content is a losing proposition. We need to develop opportunities that encourage broader and recombinant use of our content. And finally, we're going to distinguish ourselves as publishers if we can provide readers with tools that help them draw upon context to manage abundance. Clearly, we'll need new skill sets to compete in an era of abundance. We'll probably have to add a lot more training than we've ever done in the past. But those aren't the toughest challenges. Changing workflow is. Now, I wanted to leave you on a stronger, happier note than that. Change can be hard, and we all need new reasons to try something different. A short while ago, I asked you to leave Haroon and join me in a leap of imagination, but I'd like to travel back to the Sea of Stories, where the Water Genie has been busy explaining something to Haroon. If explained that these were the streams of story, and that each colored strand represented and contained a single tale. Different parts of the ocean contain different sorts of stories, and as all the stories that had ever been told, and many that were still being in the process of being invented could be found here, the ocean of the streams of story was in fact the biggest library in the universe. And because the stories were held here in fluid form, they retained the ability to change, to become new versions of themselves, to join up with other stories, and so become yet other stories. So that unlike a library of books, the ocean of the streams of story was much more than a storeroom of yarns. It was not dead, but alive. Like Haroon, like Haroon, we in publishing can sometimes be filled with a sense of hopelessness and failure. Oh, lost, and by the wind grieved ghost, come back again. But like Haroon, we're also perched atop a tapestry of breathtaking complexity. It's a time of remarkable opportunity in publishing, but it's one in which we must make a leap away from the things that we're comfortable with. I can wade grief, whole pools of it, but the least push of joy breaks up my feet. Yes, we face a significant challenge preparing for a very different world, but it's a challenge that I think we have the insight and experience to meet. A dream of method first, in which the mind is malleable, its products as revisable as sentences. That last snippet of poetry from the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet C.K. Williams, a 1954 graduate of Columbia High School. What we choose to do now will begin to determine which stories get told, as well as who writes and publishes them. With that, in good XML fashion, I will close my tag. This story is ending, but I hope it spurs some of your own. And as it does, I ask that you all think more about context and that you continue to imagine. I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon, but I'd also like to thank the folks at O'Reilly Media for hosting this conversation, Kat Meyer, who has done instrumental work in putting together a really great program for you in these 3 days, as well as several people who contributed in the development and refinement of this program. There's also the gentleman who came up and saved this presentation is its designer, my iconic pirate and oldest son, who designed everything that you saw today. Thank you.